you would, let me just first briefly introduce our speakers for today. And it is my honor to introduce everyone. First, we have Mickey Erday from Halteres and Rich Thayer from Halteres. And also we've got Joris van der Heijden from StarFish Medical. And at the end, we will have Scott Phillips, who's the President and CEO of StarFish Medical. He'll be our moderator today for the Q&A that we'll have after the presentations. So let me just introduce quickly what is Medical Device Playbook. We took our Playbook event online last year. Used to be an in-person event that we hosted a couple times a year, and it gave chance for entrepreneurs and some of our clients to tell a little bit about their challenges and their success stories to share and help others learn. So it's been quite a useful thing. And now I'll tell you just a little bit about StarFish Medical, and who we are. We have 2 locations in Victoria, British Columbia, and Toronto, Ontario. We've got over 150 staff. We've also got people in Boston, Massachusetts, and California, and do product development and technology development across the North America. We have a wide variety of clients, both startups and also large companies. And really what we care about is making our clients successful. We do a variety of medical device and diagnostic point-of-care kinds of products that span all different departments. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Mickey Erday. He is the founder and partner at Halteres Associates, and he got his biochemistry PhD from Washington State. His postdoc was at UCSF. He invented the first viral load test for HIV and HCV and began the nucleic acids diagnostic business at Chiron in the Bay Area in the 80s. He has a wide variety of experience in the diagnostic market, and I'm sure you will enjoy hearing from Mickey. There you go, Mickey, thanks.
Thank you very much, and thanks so much for inviting us today. So you'll see Rich and my contact information on the first slide here, and if you'd like to have access to the slides after this, we're happy to send them to you. Just contact us. So let's see. Okay, how do I get this to move forward? Oh, there we go. There are 2 areas we're going to cover today. I'm going to cover success factors for diagnostic companies, and Rich will follow up with using modeling to support business sustainability in troubling times. So there's an old Roman saying that the wise man learns from the mistakes of others, the fool learns from their own. And I wish somebody had told me that 30 years ago. But in fact, what we're going to do right now is talk a bit about some of the successes and failures of other companies and lessons learned. There's quite a lag here for some reason. There we go. So I'm going to cover briefly a project we did for the Gates Foundation way back in 2000. Oops. Okay. It has a mind of its own. I don't seem to be able to get it to go backward. That looks like that works better. Okay. So this was a study we did on 28 companies, and it was because the Gates Foundation was quite interested in understanding why some of the companies they worked with did so well and others didn't. And they asked us to conduct this study. So we did this with 28 companies that we knew very deeply. And we separated them to 3 types of companies. Successes. This was based on their sustainability through revenue generation for at least 3 years, but most of them have done much better than that. People we called zombies, that we'll talk a fair amount about here, which were people that we saw were struggling and we thought, in our collective opinion, were likely to go out of business with time. We have that history from 2014 I can tell you about. And failures, companies that actually were out of business at the time that we did the study. We also identified specific events we thought were either going to result in the demise of the zombies or did for the failures, and I'll go through that. And we studied this by talking to people who worked at the companies. They were potentially board members, investors. We got a good feel for what was going on. We're not going to tell you the names of the companies, and it'll be fairly obvious why in a few moments here. But this has been published now. It's in BMJ Innovations if you want to get access to it. Okay, come on. We did this by using a series of phases to look at in the growth of products and trying to understand how well companies didn't do within them. Let me describe them briefly to you now. Phase 0, design or concept phase. This is before you're actually picking up any pipettes or doing any work. This is understanding the marketplace, understanding the customer, understanding potential competition, and developing a target product profile. And I'll come back to that in a little while, a little more depth. But basically, it's market requirements if you're not accustomed to this type of document. So this is the design phase. Next is the feasibility and planning phase. And this is where you do start picking up some tools and start doing some work. In fact, the end of this phase would be having a prototype that you think is worthy of taking into a formal development program, which is in the very next phase. Phase 2, design and development. Now you're designing it for its ultimate performance that required, and also for manufacturability. This is an issue that has been a problem for a number of companies, and I'll mention that in a moment here. Validation and launch is the next phase. This is where you're preparing for regulatory approvals if they're required, reimbursement, interaction with the medical community, societies, and doing clinical studies. Finally, phase 4 is commercialization, where you're starting to sell, you're getting the information required for payment and reimbursement, and positioning yourself for the marketplace going forward. We took those and pared them down into a smaller number of attributes that fit with all those in these 5 phases. And I'm not going to use that in this next slide, which I know is an eye chart, but please bear with me. I'll go through this. This is the most significant slide we have here. And again, at the top, we've got the phases, the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the criteria that we wanted to measure these companies with. We have the companies in the 3 categories: successes, zombies, and failures. And there are more failures than anything else because there are more lessons that we learn with that. And then you'll see that we've scored these with 3 things: success in green, moderate, they did well enough by and large, failed in our opinion, collective opinion, and then we have triggers like the zombie trigger and the failure trigger. And I'll talk about those here right now. And then you'll see in some of the companies, on the failures, we convert to these triangles, which are after those companies have gone out of business, so they're not participating in any of those activities. So for the failures, note that a lot of these failures were early on, very early in the process. They, for instance, didn't clearly define the product properly, or they attempted to get the performance required to create a market for this, but they just didn't make it. They didn't have the sensitivity, specificity, robustness, or other attributes. A lot of them went up there. Some of them got a little further along, but in these 2 cases, it really was the management team which was the problem. They didn't do a good job of running the company. They didn't raise enough money. They didn't do what was necessary. Common, quite frankly. Some of them got further. This particular one was a company that had actually done some clinical studies, looked pretty good, but then they found that they had designed it improperly. It could not be manufactured. They were going to have to redesign the product, and investors said no more. Others that got all the way out to clinical studies and failed there because it didn't perform in the field well enough. And then out here, this particular company did an okay job in some areas, but they did not design a product that was going to be reimbursable, so ultimately failed. This company was out there for nearly 10 years. So some of these were a year or so, some of them very long. Successes did most everything right. There were a couple of places where the moderate score, but they did quite well, and 2 of them did very, very well. And all except one of these are now parts of other companies that were acquired. The zombies, on the other hand, are interesting. As opposed to the failures, these guys typically got out much further. They, some of them did things that we thought were going to result in their failure early on, but some of these got very far out there, and they, in fact, did not get the reimbursement required for the company. And I'll just tell you, like I said, we did this in 2014. As of now, this month, 7 of these 8 zombies are no longer in the diagnostics business. They're gone. One of them remains, and it's not doing as well as it would like to, but 7 of the 8 are gone. So I think we did a pretty good job of scoring these. We did another score approach to this using numeric values instead of the color values. And as you might imagine, the increase in the score for the successes versus failures, and zombies lie right in between. I'm not going to address all of these questions, but those of you who want to get access to these slides, we have a series of questions that we now use in evaluating companies, evaluating ourselves in a company, and people that have an actual invested in a company or are working with a company are using questions such as these. These are specific ones in specific phases. Again, you could use those. But what I wanted to focus on here were the things that the investors focused on. So these are people with many years of experience in investing in diagnostic companies, serve on boards. And these are the things they wanted to point out. Firstly, the most important success factor in their experience has been leadership team. Are they capable of doing this? Have they done it before? And not people who worked in tools or in pharma or in biotech, but they've actually done diagnostics. They also noted that quality systems must be in place early. Many people wait too long for this, and it becomes the rate-limiting step for them. Companies must be able to have the ability and desire to partner with others with the requisite expertise, for instance, in reimbursement, in regulatory, perhaps even in manufacturing early on, at a time when they can't afford to bring those people on full-time, but they need access to the capability. And are they realistic about the projections for time to market? It can often take 5 to 7 years for successful companies to develop new biomarkers, new platforms, or 3 to 5 years, even if they're extending menu on existing platform. Although we saw in this last year that can be greatly accelerated with a lot more resources and people than would normally be available. And companies must have a very deep understanding of the customer, and that resulted in a lot of those early company failures. Who's going to use this? How will it be used? What alternatives exist? And what does the entire ecosystem look like? Because it may be something like training or laboratory capabilities that are important in addition to your product. And what are the pain points that must be dealt with? Products have got to be designed for manufacturing. And, well, I got to remember, these are investors. They must have an attractive ROI for all parties involved. So, and I would like to talk briefly about some of the best practices we noted. And there are a couple of things I want to point out. One is the development of use cases, really understanding how the product is going to be used. And I'm going to give you 3 examples from 10 that we developed for Ebola. We've also done a lot of work on this for SARS-CoV-2, which you can find on our website. But in this case, I want to talk about, again, an epidemic. So this use case would be field detection in a current epidemic setting. And in such a situation, you have to be very careful about recognizing that people are going to be wearing PPE. And so things that they might be able to do without wearing gloves or masks are not going to be possible. In this situation, specificity of the test is not quite as important as in others, because the majority of the people in this epidemic are going to have symptoms which are indicative of Ebola. So you would expect to be able to design for that. That's in contrast to the next of the use cases, which would be screening for Ebola in a site of previous outbreaks, not current. So now specificity becomes a much bigger issue, right? Because a false positive will trigger a response which may be completely overboard. So a product that's designed for this will work in the epidemic, but designed for the epidemic might not work in this post-epidemic setting. that's something that I think we're going to see a lot of in the SARS-CoV-2 world as well. And then one more example is we're seeing this again in SARS-CoV-2. You probably want to be thinking about a differential diagnostic in a situation where Ebola might be there, but it might also be Lassa, it might be Marburg, it might be something else. So you have to design for that as well. And we're seeing that with people going to the addition of flu, AB, and RSV for SARS-CoV-2 tests. Another thing that we find that many people do, and this is something we specialize in, you'll find a lot of this on our website, is design of storyboards. This helps you understand a lot of things. I mean, we use these a great deal. So here's one for TB in a point of care setting, and in fact, this is for a community healthcare worker to go to someone's home and test them. So there are three ways you can envision going there. One would be they carry it in a backpack, they carry it on in some way on a bike, or they take it in a car. If you design this product for a car, it's not likely it's going to fit into a backpack. If you design it for the backpack, certainly we have to take it by car as well. So understanding all the ways in which you want to deal with the product will be important to that final design. In a situation like this, they might be able to take the materials back to a facility for disposing of them, as opposed to trying to deal with it and burning them on site. So this could be in a clinic instead, and there now that instrument, that system could be large enough that you can leave it sitting on a table. It's a very different set of design criteria, and you don't have to worry about taking it back anywhere because you could deal with the waste materials on site. Another thing that most people do, I mentioned this earlier, that do well when they're successes is they develop target product profiles. They spend a lot of time on this, trying to understand the minimum and optimum performance of the test and attributes of the test required for the marketplace. So minimum means that if all the criteria met, the product will be acceptable for the application. That's really critical. That means it really is acceptable in that form. Versus optimal, which would make it possible for the product to be even better, but there might be issues of the time to get that done or the cost to get that done. So most of the time we find you end up at the minimum performance characteristics and go into the market with that. So this is a technology-independent assessment. And this is an example of a TPP that we performed, that we did some time ago for cryptosporidium. This is one of 4 pages, and just to give you some sense for the sort of quantitative information that we try to generate for this to really understand what the test needs to do, precision, etc., so that you're designing the thing that you really need when you go into that phase 1. And lastly, risk mitigation. Some people do this particularly well, and in fact, it's an attribute of the companies that do well. Management team has sufficient diagnostic experience. We mentioned that as being something people are very concerned about. So mitigation may be, making sure that you've got people in key positions that have the experience required. So this is, looking at this at one time. But the best practice is to actually use this as an ongoing tool to monitor your progress. So, for instance, looking at this on an ongoing basis over several quarters. So this is the management team issue again. They finally did a good job. They hired the people they needed. But you might be in a situation where you didn't assess that risk quite as well as you needed to, and it actually got worse with time. So you need to put additional resources on that, additional effort on it to get it back to where you need to be. So, revisiting risk and mitigation plans on an ongoing basis is something that companies that do well use as a common tool. So with that, then, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Rich Thayer, and I'll go to the next slide here. And I think he'll be introduced by Lynn.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mickey. That was very interesting, and we get asked a lot of very similar questions along the way when we are working with clients, so it's really helpful to see some data around that. Thank you very much. And next, I would like to introduce Rich Thayer, who is a managing partner at Halteres with Mickey. And Rich has an undergrad in biochemistry from UC Davis and his MBA from UC Berkeley. He's held a number of leadership positions in the diagnostic industry. He was director of blood screening and infectious disease business unit at Chiron, co-founder and CFO for Praxis Biosystems, and also was the VP of blood screening at Roche Molecular Systems. So lots of relevant experience, Rich, and we're happy to have you here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for the invitation to speak here this morning. Well, we've heard from Mickey several things that a company can do to increase the chances of success in terms of organization structure and objectives, et cetera, and hopefully stave off the possibility of becoming a zombie. What I will spend the next couple of minutes doing is reviewing, well, now that you have a company that has a pretty good chance of success, how does one evaluate whether or not a particular product opportunity, in fact, may lead to a sustainable business opportunity? And to do that, we're going to take a look at business modeling. This is a journey that Halteres started 10 or 12 years ago, in part with funding and support from several organizations. I've listed a couple here: FIND, Unit Aid, Children's Investment Fund Foundation, Gates Foundation, and others. Though this business model has now been applied, or this business modeling approach, in many different chronic and infectious disease areas, including HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, digital chest x-rays, even bioprocessing into oncology, cardiac testing. We've also taken a look at opportunities in high-income countries, so retail pharmacy, urgent care clinics, integrated delivery networks in the United States, as well as all sorts of different levels of health settings in low and middle-income countries. The modeling approach works across all of these sectors, and very interestingly, also can be applied to multiple testing technology types and also to devices, so nucleic acid testing, clinical chemistry, next-gen sequencing, et cetera. Rather than try to think about how to explore opportunities or applications in all these areas, in the interest of time and focus today, we're just going to be talking about HIV self-testing and presenting some examples that we have, if you will, contrived for purposes of presentation around the self-testing opportunity. And then I'll conclude with a couple of observations about how the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has impacted the ability to do business modeling. So quickly, before moving on, just a couple of background slides about business modeling and approaches. The first thing that we have found, and perhaps others in the audience as well, is it's a wonderful tool to help build a common language or lexicon for interacting with your business partners and all the other numerous stakeholders you will come across in the ecosystem you're targeting. It actually helps to clarify roles and responsibilities for these stakeholders, and also delivers, and this is very important for your funders and your venture partners, it helps to deliver or establish metrics and benchmarks for performance and impact. In fact, that's how we get started more than a decade ago developing this model, is exactly to take a look at those endpoint metrics. But one final point to remember, this goes along the lines of the story that Mickey told there. No matter how much global good a company may wish to do, in the end, they have to satisfy their investors. And I hope to present here a couple of examples of exactly how companies may take advantage of opportunities in, for instance, the self-testing market to do just that. So moving on here. One moment, my apologies. A couple of topics or terms that folks are likely aware of: total addressable market, served available market, and analysis scenarios. Many of you are probably very familiar with TAMs. They're a useful rough metric to take a look at comparing, for instance, the opportunity in Southeast Asia for TB testing versus retail pharmacy opportunities in the United States for SARS-CoV-2 testing. Not to sound ridiculous, but it gives you a very high-end apples-to-apples way to sort of compare overall market opportunities. But otherwise, they really aren't very useful numbers because they don't take into account market dynamics. They don't take into account time to market, various headwinds preventing market adoption and use and scale up, what your competition is going to be doing, etc. So in order to address that, the served available market, which is most pertinent for your company in developing your metrics and developing your goals and objectives, it's often instructive to create scenario analyses. So under a particular scenario, understanding the use case, understanding the intended use, knowing what target audience you're going after and for what indications helps build a much more realistic perspective of what your opportunity is. So very quickly on this slide, if we take a look first at the gray boxes, these are areas traditionally folks will think about first when wanting to develop a business model, taking a look at modeling inputs and outputs. It's typically populated with demographic data, disease epidemiology data, costs and cost to serve the market, etc. With outputs, as I just mentioned, looking at TAM and SAM comparisons, what happens with competitors A, B, and C, and importantly, your first look at the financials for the company. But very interesting, with just a little bit more focus and effort, the model can be expanded to deliver quite a bit more. So again, on the left-hand side, if we take a look at here, starting with the key assumptions and making sure there's a firm understanding across all your partners and stakeholders and what you intend to do and why, what your thoughts are about the market. I will come back to this and how that's changed because of the pandemic. Be very clear on the use case, the intended use for your application, where you're going to be using it, and as Mickey mentioned, those target product profile requirements, so those marketing requirements. All of that is inputs and informed through an appropriately designed modeling exercise. In the end, you not only wind up developing your financials, you also can begin to establish your critical path to market, what your next dry well dates are for funding, whether or not the market you've targeted, in fact, would benefit from external market incentives, propping up minimum volume commitments and other ways of ensuring that you can achieve your economies of scale, and finally, recommendations. So moving now to some examples of how one might apply this. Looking at HIV self-testing. So one of the things that's very important here is making sure in a diagnostics enterprise that your gross margin percentage is high enough to both attract your investors and to continue feeding your own business so your company becomes sustainable. Well, oftentimes in markets, be it in the United States or outside the U.S., the focus is on the public sector, the government-funded sector. There's a belief that funding may be more secure, that those markets may be more predictable, and there's a lot of truth to that. But if you take, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa and look at the WHO Africa region, by golly, on average, just over 25% of the entire healthcare spending opportunity comes from the private sector, not the public sector. We're with a high in Nigeria of 60% plus, and by the way, in some health conditions and disease areas, that approaches well over 90% to 10% or lower in some of the other countries. This is important to think about because of that gross margin that you're trying to achieve. So in these public markets, if your price per test remains low, but in the private market you have an opportunity for a higher test price or average selling price, that blended margin may become more attractive, as shown on the next slide. There we go. So in this case, as volumes increase, and now we are looking at a market that's growing, also experiencing some internet delays here. Well, I won't go back to that previous slide. So what the previous slide showed was the opportunity to be able to get your cost of goods down to about $1.50 as volumes grow and cross the 10 million unit threshold. And what this slide does is show you, well, okay, that's wonderful. So you're a number 2 player on the market, as shown here in the first bullet. Let's get a very aggressive 25% market share. So you're feeling pretty good. Revenues are growing, 25, 28, $30 million. But as you are pushing towards that $1.50 X-Works price, interestingly, at that top orange line, you can see this company focused only on one product, which in this case is the example of HIV self-testing, is still achieving gross margin percentages of under 40%. This company in Mickey's previous presentation would be deemed a zombie immediately. That is just not enough profit coming in to sustain the company operations or to continue to develop a portfolio, compete on manufacturing cost reduction, or anything else. And one last point in this slide is to get to this launch. Finally, in 2020, this product goes out the door. This company has accumulated $12 million in operating debt, which is somehow going to have to be paid back. So not meaning to wish to leave this as a very negative example, it's that in this particular case, this company that looks like they're on a successful track, they're staying away from zombie land, they're evaluating whether or not HIV self-testing is something that might be an appropriate opportunity. Perhaps it could be if they include both private and public markets and they think about very rapid menu follow-on. But one last point before the last slide here is what happens when competition comes. So this company has been successful. They've been able to get to the marketplace. They're still a market leader at 30%, but with your company, you guys both have over half the market. There's a couple of more recent smaller players. There's always the little guys out there nipping at the heels, picking up small market shares and eking away, 10, 20% of the marketplace. But based on the examples just shown, if you're that third or fourth entrant to the market, you are unlikely to have a business that's anywhere close to sustainable. And then on the last slide, some points, take-home messages about the impact of this pandemic. So business modeling and any modeling exercise, I'm sure folks in the audience here understand, is an inexact science, and it's highly dependent on how versed, how well prepared one is to understand the past history of the markets that you're going after, and likely huge impactors to the evolution of that segment looking forward, be it new funding sources, be it changes in policies, programs, etc. Now along comes a giant perturbation like the pandemic, and it's kind of put a lot of that on its ear, both in high-income and low- and middle-income country market segments. And there's just a couple of examples here before I close out. The carefully validated and vetted market trends, the reports that are published, be they from the Urgent Care Association of America, Retail Pharmacy Association, or WHO in various disease states, they now all have a break. They have dotted lines like you would see in baseball statistics because nobody really knows what they're going to look like going forward. Case in point, tuberculosis disease management has, by all estimates, now been set back 10 years just from the last year of pandemic response. We're seeing priorities changing at the national and at the payer level, impacting infectious and chronic diseases. Preventive medicine has largely gone away, but on the upside, you're seeing huge increases in interest in telemedicine here in the United States. So pros and cons there. You're seeing a very significant overnight change in the developer and the competitor landscape, largely because new funding sources heretofore unavailable have now come out. Going back several years, the Affordable Care Act, driving a lot of the EMR type stuff, the electronic data exchange, all the way to last year's CARES Act and last year's Act A program in Europe. Together, something $4 or $5 billion pushed into the system for developing new therapeutics and diagnostics for SARS-CoV-2. And finally, the last point to leave you with is with diagnostics manufacturing capacity. Over the last 12 months and looking forward to the next couple of months, global production capacity for diagnostics is projected to increase by several hundreds of millions of tests. So that's all well and good. It's also helping to bring new generations of technology to market globally. This isn't just a high-income country phenomenon. But what happens in the future, 2-3 years from now, when the need for these SARS-CoV-2 tests begins to diminish? What will happen to all that capacity? How will you as a company compete? Will it simply be on price, or are there other innovations that could help you be successful in the market? So as Mickey mentioned, there are many chances and opportunities for preventing your company becoming a zombie, looking at hiring practices and core competencies. But it's just as important now, perhaps more so than ever, to pay attention to your business modeling approach, understand the market and the opportunities, and what the upside possibilities are for the products that you're choosing to focus on. Lynn, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich. I greatly appreciate it, and it's interesting to hear the critical business things that you need to think about in each of these things, and probably not paid attention to enough, I would say.